What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. Today we're going to be going over the Magicka Dragonknight. The Magicka Dragonknight has kind of gotten a revival with the Summerset patch, with the changes to staves now counting as 2-piece bonuses. Magicka classes across the board got a nice buff, but Magicka DKs in particular got a nice buff with that change. Along with the changes to light attack scaling, Magicka DKs now are actually quite powerful when it comes to melee DPS. Stamina DPS still out-parse Magicka DK on average, because it's all going to depend on the skill of the specific stamina DPS player and the skill of the Magicka DK player. But Magicka DKs do in fact have kind of a role again in raids, maybe not necessarily in competitive endgame trials, but now that they're capable of pulling very good DPS again, you might start seeing Magicka DKs being run in progression style guilds, or even your standard vet trials guilds, partially for the DPS and also partially for the engulfing flames debuff, which increases the amount of flame damage that a boss can take. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gear, our attributes, our CP point distributions, our skills, our raids, pretty much everything that you need to know about this build. We'll spend some time talking about our rotation, kind of what's going on with the rotation, what we should be prioritizing, kind of what's the rationale behind doing the rotation the way we are, kind of any sort of alternatives that you might want to consider depending on the fight and things like that. And then we'll close things off with a 6 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the level of DPS that you can pull with this particular build. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here with the Magicka DK. So for starting off with our monster helm set, we are going with Zaan, because Magicka DKs pretty much have to play within melee range, mainly because two of their class abilities do require you to be within 10 meters of the enemy. We're going with Zaan here. Zaan is the monster helm set that is dropped from Scalecaller Peak, so you need to have the Dragon Bones DLC in order to get this set. If you don't have the Dragon Bones DLC, or you can't complete Scalecaller Peak on Vet, then you can replace Zaan with Grothdarr instead. Pretty much you're going to go with heavy medium here, mainly because of our 5-piece set. And you will want to have a health enchant on one of your large pieces, so I typically go with the monster helm head here. So you want both divines, of course. The difference between Zaan and Grothdarr is that Grothdarr you'll end up losing some single target damage, but you'll gain some AoE damage, so it's much better for fights where you have a lot of trash to take care of, so boss fights with adds or just trash fights between bosses. Grothdarr does give you max magicka instead of Zaan's spell crit, so you will see a little bit of a shift in your stats overall if you are using Grothdarr. Now for our 5-piece, we have Siroria on our body piece. So Siroria, it does drop from the new trial of Cloud Rest. You can go with the perfect or the imperfect version, doesn't really matter which one. The difference between them is the additional 5-piece max magicka bonus. If you do not have 5 perfect versions, then you lose that max magicka bonus, which doesn't really add too much to your DPS. It is a nice boost, but it's fairly small and insignificant overall when compared to other factors of your DPS parse. Our armor is going to be all divines with max magicka enchants. Now for our jewelry, our second 5-piece is going to be Burning Spellweave. You can get this from City of Ash 1 or 2. We are going with jewelry and flame staff here, but you can go with any 3 body pieces as long as the jewelry, as long as Siroria is always going to be active on both bars. That's kind of the most important thing here, so you can kind of play around with how you have this set up here. We have 3 spell damage glyphs on our jewelry pieces, and then we have 1 Bloodthirsty with 2 Arcane. You can go with 3 Bloodthirsty instead for fights with more difficult execute phases, so for example the Assembly General in Hall's Fabrication, maybe in Rakat, in Vima, or in Ethereal Archive, the Mage on hard mode. You might want to go with 3 Bloodthirsty instead. It's really going to be dependent on how many DPS are running Bloodthirsty, because you kind of get diminishing returns the more Bloodthirsties you have in group, mainly because the fight's just going to last for a shorter period of time, so overall your DPS will not necessarily be quite as high. Plus you're making kind of a trade-off with running 3 Bloodthirsty in that you are losing DPS during the first 75% of the boss's health. With Arcane, you don't have that sort of problem. You have that boost throughout the entire fight, so you're kind of making a trade-off here. You're giving up a little bit of extra DPS on the execute phase in order to get some damage throughout the entire fight instead. But 3 Bloodthirsty on a Magicka is perfectly viable to use as well. For our front bar, again, we have Burning Spellweave Inferno Staff infused with the Flame Damage enchant. And then for our back bar, we have the Maelstrom Inferno Staff infused with a Weapon Damage enchant. So again, we do need a health enchant on one of our large pieces, so make sure you have a health enchant on your head, chest, or legs, and this is because we are using Witchmother's Potent Brew, so we do need that health enchant in order to get our health up to an acceptable level. We're still kind of below the 17k recommended health for vet trials, so you might want to add some points into health over here in our attribute points to hit 17k, or you can leave it as is. I'm very comfortable running Magicka DKs, Magicka classes in general, so I typically just stick with the amount of health that I have here. Now, if you are going to choose your race, make sure to be a Dark Elf. Dark Elves get 7% additional flame damage, and they also get 9% additional max Magicka, 6% max stamina, and then 2% additional frost and shock damage. But it's really that 7% additional flame damage that really comes into play here, because pretty much all of your damage comes from flame damage sources, so Dark Elves by and far are the best race choice when it comes to Magicka Dragonknights. The other race that you might want to consider going for is going to be the Ultimate. They get 10% max Magicka, 9% Magicka regen, and then they get 4% flame, shock, and frost damage. So they're a little bit worse than Dark Elves when it comes to the pure amount of raw damage that they get. However, with the additional regen, they do get some better sustain overall, and that sustain does end up helping out overall with the Magicka DK. Magicka DKs generally are considered to have some of the worst sustain in the game, second probably only to the Magicka Sorcerer. So that's something you want to take into consideration. The final race that I would recommend is going to be the Bretons. Bretons get 10% max Magicka, 3960 additional spell resistance, so they get really nice survivability boost from that. And then they get 3% reduction on their Magicka abilities, 3% cost reduction. So that also helps out your sustain a little bit, not quite as much as the Ultimate's Magicka regen, because that does 9% does scale based, like it does affect pretty much all sources of Magicka regen. So that's something to take into consideration there. Now for our attributes, I have 64 points in the Magicka, but like I said earlier, if you do feel like you want to hit 17k health or so, you can shift a couple of points from health from Magicka into health. If you shift about 4 or 5 points from Magicka into health, you will get up to the 17k recommended health threshold for those who are just starting to learn vet trials. For our Mundus Stone, we're going with the Apprentice. You can go with the Lover instead, so this particular build is optimized around having Alkosh in group. So if you don't have Alkosh in group, then you are going to be losing out on about 3000 penetration, so it might be worth running the Lover instead. You might end up over penetrating a little bit, but that's not that big of a deal. Typically you'll be over penetrating by like 300 to 400 if you're running the Lover, but without Alkosh. So that's kind of up to you if you want to do that or not. I personally just run the Apprentice. When I do have Alkosh and when I don't have Alkosh, I usually just end up running the Lover and just shift some points out of spell erosion, so that way I'm not over penetrating by too much when they're in a fight. Now for our food, we are using Witchmother's Potent Brew for that additional sustain, so we do get 319 additional Magicka regen that is boosted by any sort of passives that we might have. Then we also gain some max Magicka and max health. It's not as much when you compare it to blue food, but on the other hand, we are gaining some sustain with Witchmother. So you can go with blue food if you would like, but I prefer Witchmother's Potent Brew for that additional sustain. Being able to sustain better basically means you have more opportunities to use your spammable, so you're not wasting time charging up a heavy attack or something like that. So that's something that you do want to take in consideration when deciding what food you're going to be using. Now we are going to be using balance to sustain, so you could reasonably use blue food, but you will have to run sustain balance a little bit more often if you are going to be using blue food. Now for our skills. For our front bar here, we're going with Molten Whip. You can go with the other morph, which is Flame Lash. Because off balance only has a 25% uptime and there is a 3-second cooldown on Flame Lash, I don't find it to be quite as strong as it used to be pre-Dragon Bones, before they changed the way off balance worked. So I prefer to go for Molten Whip for the additional spell damage to my Ardent Flame abilities. You can go with other potential spambles, so Force Pulse is another spamble that you could decide to go with, or Crushing Shock if you want the ranged interrupt. or you can use Elemental Weapon from the Sigil Order skill line instead as a spam bolt. This will do less damage overall, but it's also cheaper, so you basically trade off damage in return for additional sustain. So that's kind of a decision that you have to make. I personally prefer Molten Whip, but I have had some pretty good success using Elemental Weapon and Force Pulse. Burning Embers here. Engulfing Flames, so these are two dots from the Ardent Flame line. This is where I'd put my shield, but for purposes of the parse, I have Elemental Drain here. And we have Inner Light, and then we have Fiery Rage. You won't really be using Fiery Rage all too much, even as an AoE ultimate, because Standard does have an AoE around it. This is mainly here for the Ancient Knowledge passive, because you do need to have an Destro Staff ability slotted in order to gain the Ancient Knowledge boost. Now for our back bar, we have Flames of Oblivion, Eruption, Blockade of Fire, Rearming Trap for the Minor Force. This also helps out our sustain because we're using stamina to gain Minor Force instead of Magicka through Accelerate. Balance, this is going to be helpful for our sustain. And then Standard of Might, this is going to be our primary ultimate here. This increases the damage done by 15% and reduces the damage taken by 15%, and this damage reduction does also stack with Major Maim and Major Protection. So Standard of Might is a pretty powerful ultimate in places where you might need to stack up some damage mitigation, for example Assembly General in halls. So definitely a very powerful ultimate to use. That 50% additional damage done is also really nice. It does stack with Major Slayer and Minor Slayer as well. Alright, so that's pretty much it in terms of, there's not really that many flex spots here. Sometimes if you are running something Maw Blockade, you might be asked to put a Unrelenting Grip on the Twins fight. If you are going to be using Unrelenting Grip, I would swap out Rearming Trap for Unrelenting Grip, or you can swap out Balance for Unrelenting Grip. It's kind of up to you which one you want to do. But that's for a very specific fight. So that's really the only kind of ability that you might consider using outside of these abilities here. Now, some people do like to swap out Eruption or Flames of Oblivion to put them on the front bar and put Engulfing Flames or Burning Embers on the back bar. It's kind of up to you if you want to do it. I like to have, at the very least, I like to have all of my Ardent Flame abilities, or as many as I can, on my front bar here. So that's why I have Burning Embers and Engulfing Flames here. It's kind of up to you. The rotation, it really isn't going to change all too much. Overall, just because a lot of these abilities do have very similar durations. Now for our CP points, we have 250 CPs across each of the 3 nodes. So we'll start off with our green CPs here. We have 75 into Arcanist and 75 into Nasty. That leaves 100 points which you can put into the remaining nodes wherever you'd like, depending on which specific passives you want to get. So I personally have 40 into Shadow Ward, 31 into Tumbling, and then 29 into Warlord here. But again, you can split them up depending on what kind of passives you want. For example, if you are still leveling up your crafting stuff, you might want to get the Inspiration Boost passive in order to get some additional inspiration. For our blue CPs, I'd like to reiterate that I am optimized around having Alkosh active in group, so that's an additional 3,000 penetration. If you don't have Alkosh in group, then you might need to put more points into Spell Erosion here in order to make up for that loss in penetration. So if you do need to put more points into Spell Erosion, you can drop Elemental Expert down to 56. I wouldn't really touch Elfborn anymore. 56 is probably the lowest I would go with Elfborn. And then you can start taking stuff out of Staff Expert and Master at Arms. You can pretty much leave Thaumaturge alone here, and then you can basically put into Spell Erosion until you hit the penetration cap. So that's kind of how you go about kind of making up the Spell Erosion CPs if you don't have Alkosh. Don't have Alkosh and you decide to use the Apprentice instead of the Lover. So for this particular build, we have 56 into Elfborn, 64 into Elemental Expert, 11 into Spell Erosion, 27 into Staff Expert, 52 into Master at Arms, and 40 into Thaumaturge. And finally, for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach. Anybody who's followed my builds knows that I take a one-size-fits-most approach on these build videos. However, depending on the specific trial that you are running, you might need to shift some CP points around in order to best mitigate the damage that you're going to be taking. So for example, in Ethereal Archive, you're taking a lot of magical damage, so you might want to shift some points out of Hardy, put them into Ally Defender or Spell Shield. For the balanced approach, 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick Skin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Now there is a passive under the Lord called Field Physician, which requires 10 points. So you can put them in a quick recovery or bastion. If you go up to 11, you get the jump point, so I recommend going up to 11. Whenever you resurrect another player, your damage taken is reduced by 15% during the duration of the resurrection. So this is really helpful to have just for a lot, especially for progression guilds, for that damage reduction while you're resurrecting somebody. You have your shield up, and this does affect the damage your shield takes. So this will basically allow you to get the resurrection off and while staying alive at the same time. So that's pretty much it for all of the build stuff. So real quick, I do want to touch base on kind of alternative sets here if you don't have Siroria. If you don't have Siroria, you can go with Burning Spellweave Body, and then you can go with something like a Mechanical Acuity as your second 5-piece that's active on your front bar. Other potential options here are going to include, let me just quickly pull them out. You can go with Moondancer instead if you would like. Moondancer is not a terrible choice to choose. If you do decide to go with Moondancer, Burning Spellweave, I would recommend, doesn't really matter which one you have on your front bar, but I would just probably stick with Moondancer, so that way Burning Spellweave is active at all times. So that way you'll be able to get Burning Spellweave procs while you're on your back bar as well. If you do decide to go with Moondancer on your front bar, just be mindful of where you activate synergies. You have to activate them on the front bar to get the Shadow Blessing or Lunar Blessing. And then you do have the Silks of the Sun set here. Let me pull it out real quick. So you can go with Silks of the Sun. This is a light armor set that's dropped from Stonefalls. Silks of the Sun is pretty strong on Magicka DKs because, again, most of your damage does come from flame damage abilities. This is going to be a set that you're going to wear on your body, so you would have Burning Spellweave as your front bar ability or Acuity. The nice part about having Silks of the Sun is that the 2-piece does give you max health, so you don't need to put a health enchant on any of your large pieces if you decide to go with Silks of the Sun instead. And then there is one final set that you could wear as well. That's going to be an overland set. It's going to be Mother's Sorrow. Let me pull it out. Mother's Sorrow is a dropped set that comes from Deshaan. So you can go with Mother's Sorrow. This basically gives you a bunch of spell crit. You can really, you can surprisingly use Mother's Sorrow as a front bar weapon, so you could only have the 4 and 5 piece active on your front bar. But I'd probably say if you are going to be using Mother's Sorrow with, for example, Burning Spellweave, then put Mother's Sorrow on your body and have Burning Spellweave active on your front bar. If you're going with something like Mother's Sorrow and Silks of the Sun, however, have Silks of the Sun be on your body at all times, and then do Mother's Sorrow front bar instead. So that's kind of how it all plays out there. So basically, what you want to do is you want to make sure your proc set, whether that's Moondancer, Siroria, Burning Spellweave, you want those to be typically on your front bar. And then you want to have your constant effects, so Silks of the Sun, Mother's Sorrow, for example, or you want those active on your body piece as much as you can. It's more important for Silks of the Sun compared to Mother's Sorrow, but ideally you would have either of them, if you're using either of them, active on your 5-piece at all times. Mother's Sorrow, you can have that as a front bar set. It's kind of up to you, and it really depends on the sets that you are running specifically. Alright, now that we've talked about all of the possible gear combinations, let's go ahead and talk about our rotation a little bit. So Dragon Knights kind of have a little bit of a static rotation, so the duration of our abilities sort of line up fairly well. Depends on how you really kind of view them. So Blockade has an 8-second duration, so we're always going to be basing it around Blockade. Flames of Oblivion has a 15-second duration, so that's kind of all lines up right with Blockade. And then Eruption has an 18-second duration. So Eruption typically is going to be the last damage ability that we cast before we do Rearming Trap or Balance. So we typically do on our back bar rotation Blockade, Flames of Oblivion if we need to re-up it, and then Eruption. That's just because 8 times 2 is 16, so we do need to have 2 extra seconds there. So using Eruption last does give us that extra 2 seconds to basically let it run its entire duration here. Burning Embers is a 10-second duration, as is Engulfing Flames, so these are not very good overall in terms of duration. So typically you will end up overcasting Engulfing and Burning Embers on this particular setup. If you swap this out with something like Flames of Oblivion or Eruption, you're still going to have a little bit of issues with them lining up very well with Blockade, but not quite as much. Basically, again, you would just use that as your second ability, so you always start with Blockade on your back bar. That's pretty much going to be the rule here. You always do Blockade first on your back bar, and then you use your other two damage abilities. You want to end with Rearming Trap or Balance, depending on if you need to use Balance or not in order to sustain yourself. And you can bar swap cancel out of the animation. So for example, you can drop Rearming Trap and then bar swap cancel out of the entire animation. So this would be the entire animation there, but you can bar swap cancel out of it, and you can still have that trap go down. Balance too, you can animation cancel out of balance, so that's the full animation, but you can bar swap cancel out of it like so, and you still lose the health and gain the Magicka when you do the bar swap cancel. So for our rotation, again, drink up your potion first, and then you actually will not start with your ultimate. That's because you do want your dots running before you drop your ultimate, because your ultimate increases the damage done. So you do want your dots to be running while you have that buff going on. So like I said, we always start off with Blockade, then I do Flames, Rearming Trap, and then you drop your ultimate here, then Engulfing, Burning Embers. Then you go back to your back bar there to re-up Blockade. So you will have to go back to the back bar to reapply Blockade, because the other abilities on your back bar have a longer duration. Then you do Eruption, then you do Balance again, and so on and so forth. So it's in terms of front bar skills that you want to have active at all times, you always want to have Engulfing Flames up, and that's because of the debuff that Engulfing Flames applies to the enemies, which makes them take 10% more damage from all fire damage attacks. As a bag decay, all of your damage is fire attacks, so you do want to have that Engulfing Flames debuff up at all times. So it's okay if you'll let Burning Embers drop off for a little bit, but definitely try not to have Engulfing Flames drop off at all. Try to make sure Engulfing Flames is up at all times. This not only affects the damage you do, but also the damage that your other magic DPS are also doing as well. So it really helps out, for example, your Magicka Nightblades, your Magicka Swords, if they're running double Inferno staves. It helps out everybody who has flame damage. So it's really important to have that debuff up at all times. In terms of when to use Balance, I typically tend to use it whenever I need to sustain, so it's not going to be every single time on my back bar. Typically it's going to be every second time I'm on my back bar, so whenever I have to do the full back bar rotation, so again that'd be Blockade, Engulfing, Eruption, Rearming Trap, and then I do Balance there, and that would typically give me enough to recoup about like 75% of the cost of my back bar abilities. So that's typically what I use Balance. Every other bar swap is when I would use it. So with all that in mind, we're going to go ahead and do a 6 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the amount of DPS that you're able to pull. My dogs are running around, so I apologize if you guys hear that in the background. So this is going to be 6 million dummy parse here. We do get minor force through Rearming Traps. So that's something to keep in mind if you are wanting to compare the Magicka DPS, the DPS from Magicka DK to other Magicka DPS. So that's something just to take into consideration here. I will try to narrate throughout the parse so you guys can get an idea of what's going on during the parse. So let's go ahead and get started here. So I like to open up with the Rearming Trap. And again, we lay down our standard after we apply all of our dots, so that way all of our damage is starting to tick when we get that 15% additional damage done. This is when I use Balance. Remember to bar swap cancel out of Balance. There is one set that I forgot to mention. That's because I don't actually have it on this tune. That's going to be Elfbane. Elfbane improves the duration of all of your damage abilities except for Flames of Oblivion by 2 seconds, and does also affect Zaan as well. And so that's going to be very helpful, Elfbane, because it does give you more time to use your spamble, because your dots are lasting for a longer period of time. So that gives you more time to do your spamble instead of having to reapply your dots. Elfbane comes from Blasteria, so you will have to go into Cyrodiil and gain rewards of the worthy, or just buy them from the Blasterius merchant if your faction controls Blasterius. The downside of running Elfbane is that it is a heavy armor set, so you will have to run jewelry, and you do want it active on all times, so you will have 2 heavy armor pieces. So you will not be able to do 5-1-1 with Elfbane. You will have to do 5 light, 2 heavy, so you will lose out on 2% additional resources just from losing the Undaunted passive, losing that 1 medium armor piece. You can see here, rotation does usually end up being a little bit dynamic here. I also recasted an ability early, so that's one reason why my rotation's a little bit messed up right now. So you can see here that Burning Embers is what helps us heal from the damage that we take from running balance. Alright, so that is our DPS. That's our parse there. Again, I did end up screwing up my rotation. I casted, I think, Flames of Oblivion early, so I ended up with a more different rotation overall. So here is our parse. So we're pulling about 41.4k with this build here, which is pretty nice. Again, stamina DPS generally are able to pull higher. Like Stamina Wardens, Stamina Templars are still able to pull higher than Magicka DKs, but on the other hand, this is a really nice boost compared to what Magicka DKs used to be able to pull on Dragon Bones. So they're definitely high up there when it comes to DPS. They are doing better off than Magicka Sorcerers in general. They're not doing quite as well as Magicka Nightblades, but in terms of DPS, Magicka DKs are probably second in terms of pure DPS. But again, the weakness is they do have to play in melee range, so Stamina DPS do pull better DPS. However, Magicka DKs do provide Engulfing Flames, which is really a nice debuff, and it's a nice little DPS boost for all the Magicka DPS. So if your tank doesn't want to run Engulfing Flames, then you can run a Magicka DK instead and not lose that much DPS compared to which sort of what stamina DPS you are replacing here. So for Siroria's, because we're standing still, we got really good uptime on the Siroria boon here. But on more mobile fights, you will have to be a little bit more mindful of when you need to go back into the circle. You do need to touch the circle every 5 seconds in order to maintain that stack. If you let the stack drop, you lose all of them all at once. So just keep in mind of when you need to use Siroria, when you need to step back into the circle. Even on mobile fights like Asylum, it is kind of it does require a little bit of thought and a little bit of planning, but you are able to maintain very good uptime on Sirorias even in fights like Asylum and Cloud Rest. For Burning Spellweave, this is lower than usual, what you would normally expect, mainly because Burning Spellweave in this instance is our front bar only, so it'll only proc while we're on our front bar. It's not active at all times. Now we could swap weapons out. We could go with Siroria on our front bar and Burning Spellweave as our body. That will give us better Burning Spellweave uptime, and we'll actually won't lose that much uptime on Siroria that way either. But generally speaking, in trial scenario, I'd prefer to have Burning Spellweave on our front bar, on my front bar here, mainly because I will typically have at least 1 or 2 dots running, so I'll always have a chance to proc Burning Spellweave. But for Siroria's boon, it's really going to be dependent on which bar I'm going to be on, because if I'm on my back bar when Siroria's drops, I'm going to have to basically swap to my front bar and basically cast Whip or Elemental Weapon or something in order to gain that boon back, so that way I can continue to maintain my stacks. So I personally prefer Burning Spellweave front bar, but you can go with Siroria front bar instead. It really depends on what Inferno step you happen to get first here. So you can see here, light attacks make up a very sizable portion of our DPS. About over 25% of our DPS come from light attacks. Molten Whip is our very powerful spammable here. You can see averaging about 19k, really strong here. And then Blockade, Flames of Oblivion. Zaan, again, very strong monster helm set. It comes up 5th in terms of our damage contribution, and everything kind of falls off from there. But you can see that all of our damage is fire damage, so that's why Burning Spellweave, Silks of the Sun, they're all very powerful when on Magicka DKs. Alright, so that's it for this build video. If you guys have any questions or comments about this video, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.